Indeed, I've encountered numerous bizarre HOA tales over the years. Instances of officials exerting excessive control regarding mailbox hues, heated arguments concerning grass length, the complete spectrum of such issues. However, my personal experience surpasses them all. It likely sets a new standard for HOA overstepping and unmitigated foolishness. They declared that my lake, my magnificent spring-fed lake, the very feature that motivated my property purchase, constituted a flood hazard. A flood hazard, indeed. This serene expanse of water, steadfast for generations, was abruptly deemed a threat by them. And their response to this alleged impending peril? They emptied it, pumped it completely dry, resulting in a desolate, muddy gash. Then, to compound the egregious act, they covered the ravaged terrain with pavement and marked it for parking. A scorching, dark, lifeless expanse of asphalt replaced what was once my personal haven, all to accommodate a few additional spots for their excessively large, fuel-consuming SUVs. Yet, they committed a monumental error. They chose to confront an individual they shouldn't have. I am Arthur Jenkins, a civil engineer by profession. My area of expertise is hydrology, the science of water, its motion, and its allocation. Believe me when I assert that water invariably discovers a path. This narrative is quite extraordinary, and its resolution is something you will find hard to credit. The genesis of this affair was roughly 10 years ago upon discovering a small piece of paradise nestled beside what was, at that time, a relatively recent yet swiftly growing suburban community known as Willow Creek Estates. The designation was quite ironic considering the developers had culverted most of the actual Willowland creeks to optimize plot dimensions. My land, by contrast, was an exception. It consisted of a 5-acre plot adjacent to the development on one boundary while its remaining 3 perimeters were still primarily uncultivated forest. And the centerpiece, its very essence, was a breathtaking 2-acre natural lake. Though not immense, it possessed considerable depth, was spring-fed, remarkably clear, and abounded with aquatic life, bass, bluegill, and the infrequent heron patiently angling along its shores. Mature oak and maple trees encircled its perimeter, their boughs arching towards the water's surface. This place served as my personal refuge. During sweltering summer afternoons, I would swim in its waters, fish from my modest rowboat, or simply relax on the small wooden jetty I had constructed, observing the sunset color the water with shades of orange and purple. The former proprietor, an elderly gentleman who had resided there for 50 years, informed me that the lake had existed for as long as memory served, a steadfast element of the terrain. It was a natural hollow that gathered spring water and precipitation, gradually discharging it into the subsoil and via a tiny, nearly imperceptible seepage that ultimately reached a remote creek. From a hydrological perspective, it represented an impeccably balanced system, a natural retention and detention basin, so to speak. For the initial few years, I simply relished it, tending to the property and generally preferring my own company. I was aware of an HOA for Willow Creek Estates, but as my land wasn't technically included in the original plat and I had no inclination towards their communal swimming pool or meticulously groomed and sterile common grounds, I gave them scant attention. That, as events would show, was a naive stance. The difficulties commenced subtly, as they frequently do. It began with Mr. Henderson, Gerald Henderson. He held the position of HOA president, a gentleman whose sense of self-importance appeared to grow in direct relation to the imagined extent of his power. He was one of those individuals in his mid-50s, invariably clad in golf shirts a size too snug, with a consistently flushed face that suggested either high blood pressure or perhaps simply persistent outrage. He operated a brilliant white Escalade, the type that has never encountered a fleck of dirt, and he appeared to view the entirety of Willow Creek Estates as his personal thief. My first significant encounter with him occurred when he dispatched a rather formal letter to me. Complaining about the unsightly appearance of the wild milkweed I permitted to flourish along my fence adjacent to one of the HOA common areas. I was cultivating it for monarch butterflies, a small ecological endeavor of mine. I replied, politely explaining this, but Henderson showed no interest in ecology unless it pertained to perfectly even stripes on a chemically saturated lawn. He fumed. He protested. He likely grumbled about property values, but since the fence line was technically mine and the milkweed was not classified as noxious by any county regulation, he had limited recourse. Nevertheless, I sensed I had created an adversary. Or, more precisely, he had decided I was an impediment that required leveling. Over the subsequent year or so, other minor conflicts arose. Grievances about the sound of frogs emanating from my lake. Frogs, imagine, in a location literally named Willow Creek. Admonishments regarding my compost bin being visible despite its placement a good 100 feet from any HOA land. On each occasion, I would review the county regulations, verify I was acting within my entitlements, and courteously apprise Mr. Henderson of this. Each such exchange seemed to intensify his displeasure. He was clearly unaccustomed to anyone disputing his decrees. Then, approximately 2 years ago, the rumors began. Henderson started discussing at HOA meetings as relayed to me by a somewhat understanding neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a reserved widow who genuinely valued the birdsong from my property, the necessity for additional guest parking. Willow Creek Estates, you understand, had been constructed with rather restricted streets and minimal driveway capacity. Henderson pictured a pleasant, well-organized parking area, a monument to his forward-thinking leadership. The issue was the scarcity of appropriate common land remaining that had not already been landscaped or allocated for another purpose. And that is when his attention, like that of a predatory bird, fixated on the underused area occupied by my splendid lake. The initial formal attack arrived as an engineering report commissioned by the HOA, which landed in my mailbox with a discernible impact. The document, authored by a company I had never encountered but which Henderson praised as premier, determined that my serene 100-year-old lake presented a considerable and escalating flood danger to the properties situated downhill in Willow Creek Estates. My lake, a flood danger? I chuckled. It was the most absurd claim I had ever encountered. If anything, my lake lessened flood danger. It functioned as a natural absorbent, taking in substantial rainfall and releasing it gradually. The sheer nerve of it, the blatant lie, was astounding. But my amusement vanished as I perused the report's proposal. The lake ought to be drained and the terrain regraded to guarantee adequate stormwater control, which conveniently would also create an optimal site for highly desired community parking amenities. A chill went down my spine. Henderson was no longer merely targeting my milkweed. He was aiming for the very core of my residence. The lines of conflict were clearly established. I instantly grasped the strategy Henderson was employing. He had fabricated a crisis, the flood danger, to legitimize taking control of the land my lake occupied, or at least making it unsuitable for its natural function so he could convert it for his favored parking lot scheme. The engineering report he had obtained was, frankly, a farce. I examined it, my professional judgment affronted with every page. It was replete with suppositions, defective methods, and conclusions that appeared to be foregone. They indicated increased impervious surfaces in the vicinity due to construction as a reason for this purported flood danger from my lake, entirely disregarding that my lake existed before all that construction and had been managing water in the area impeccably for a century. It was a classic instance of deflecting blame. They even included some indistinct aerial photographs taken after an especially intense, once-in-a-decade storm, displaying the lake's water level slightly elevated, and presented this as proof of its hazardous potential. The irony, which I would only come to fully appreciate much later, was their complaint about water having nowhere to go while concurrently intending to eliminate one of the most significant natural drainage and retention features nearby. My initial action was to compose a thorough refutation. As a hydrologist, this was my area of expertise. I gathered historical rainfall figures for the locality, geological assessments, and topographical charts dating back to the early 1900s that showed the lake as a permanent characteristic. I performed my own analyses, my own simulations demonstrating unequivocally that the lake acted as an essential buffer, diminishing peak runoff to the lower-lying sections of Willow Creek Estates. In truth, I contended its removal would heighten the flood danger to Henderson's constituents, as rainwater would have fewer areas to naturally accumulate and seep. I elaborated on the biodiversity the lake sustained, its function in local aquifer replenishment, and referenced several environmental protection directives that the HOA appeared to be casually disregarding. I submitted all of this, meticulously organized and bound, at the subsequent HOA board meeting. Henderson presided at the head of the table, arms folded, a self-satisfied little smile on his face as I presented. The other board members, primarily a group of sycophants who seemed intimidated by Henderson's aggressive demeanor, hardly looked at me. When I concluded, Henderson merely stated, "We appreciate your input, Mr. Jenkins. We have our own specialists and they hold a different view. The welfare of this community is of utmost importance." He then proceeded to the following item on the agenda as though I had been discussing meteorology. The rejection was complete. I sought advice from a lawyer, a competent man named Bill, who focused on property disagreements. He was understanding but pessimistic. "Arthur," he remarked, "HOAs are complex entities. Their covenants, conditions, and restrictions (CCRs) frequently grant them extensive authority. If they can persuade a judge or even just themselves that a valid safety issue exists, they can be exceedingly difficult to thwart, even if they are encroaching on what seems like your private land. Particularly if the lake involves any sort of shared watercourse or perceived effect on common areas. He indicated that while a segment of the lake was undoubtedly on my deeded property, its influence, as the HOA report described, reached beyond my property lines. The HOA contended that the risk it presented was to their properties. Bill suggested we could contest it, but the process would be costly, protracted, and the result was doubtful. They possessed their expert report, however deficient. We would require our own equally qualified experts to challenge it in court. And even then, judges frequently deferred to HOAs on community safety matters unless there was unequivocal proof of ill intent or severe negligence, which was challenging to establish when they were concealing their actions behind a facade of due diligence. Henderson, in the meantime, was actively influencing the community. He conducted informational meetings, which Mrs. Gable characterized as Henderson vociferating about immediate threats and the selfishness of a single person jeopardizing the entire community for a puddle. He depicted me as an uncooperative loner, indifferent to the welfare of my neighbors. He displayed polished architectural illustrations of the intended parking area, Henderson Plaza, as some satirists were already dubbing it, featuring small landscaped medians and ornamental illumination. He assured everyone it would enhance property values and resolve all their parking difficulties. Some homeowners, especially those who often entertained visitors or owned multiple vehicles, were persuaded. Others felt apprehensive but were reluctant to openly defy Henderson. The HOA predictably voted to approve the lake remediation and community enhancement project. I was served a formal notification via certified mail stating that operations to drain the lake and build the parking facility would begin in 30 days. It referenced various stipulations in the HOA master plan concerning the assurance of correct drainage and the board's power to operate in the interest of community safety. It was tantamount to a declaration of hostilities. The notion of those machines, those pipes, desecrating my haven, obliterating something so exquisite and essential for something so utterly common and unsightly, instilled in me a fury so intense it was almost serene. A frigid, methodical rage. They were genuinely intending to proceed. They were going to obliterate my lake. And I recognized with a sinking feeling that the preliminary legal confrontations were improbable to halt them sufficiently soon. Time was running out. The day the equipment appeared is indelibly etched in my mind. I was awakened by the low roar of heavy vehicles, the harsh splutter of diesel engines. Glancing through my window coverings, I beheld them. A colossal excavator, a bulldozer, several large flatbed trucks transporting enormous pumps and spools of substantial black tubing. They were assembling on the HOA common land that bordered the edge of my lake, the section Henderson had shrewdly marked as the main entry point for the remediation. Henderson himself was present, naturally, sporting a vibrant yellow hard hat that appeared absurd atop his golf shirt. He was gesturing widely, commanding the work crew like a cut-rate Napoleon. A feeling of sickness washed over me. My attorney had succeeded in applying for an emergency injunction, but the court date was still a week away, and he had cautioned me that success was unlikely. Henderson was clearly trying to beat that deadline, intending to present the court with an irreversible situation. A drained lake, he likely reasoned, was more difficult to refill. I stood on my small wooden dock, an impotent observer of my lake's demise. The laborers, to their credit, seemed mostly detached, merely performing their duties. They installed the high-capacity pumps, the intake hoses extending into the pristine water like predatory serpents. Then, with a thunderous clamor, the pumps surged to life. Water, my exquisite, clean lake water, started to pour out through the discharge hoses, directed into a rapidly excavated trench leading towards a storm drain network several hundred yards distant, a system intended for rainwater runoff, not the continuous emptying of a 2-acre expanse of water. I observed the water level commence its descent, gradual at first, then accelerating. The lake's edges, once softly lapping, pulled back, revealing muddy banks that had been underwater for decades. Fish, disoriented and confined in the diminishing pools, began to thrash frantically. Herons and egrets, frequent visitors to my lake, circled above, emitting cries of distress, as if they comprehended the desecration occurring below. It was a miniature ecological disaster, orchestrated by nescience and presumption. I attempted to step in to converse with the supervisor, presenting my property documents, clarifying that a substantial part of the lake bed belonged to me. He merely gestured with a shrug towards Henderson, who was now watching from the air-conditioned comfort of his Escalade, and remarked, "Consult the chief, friend. I just follow instructions." Henderson, predictably, declined to even lower his window, merely offering me that exasperatingly smug smile. The draining persisted for 2 excruciating days. The water level receded foot by foot, uncovering the lake's concealed topography, its deeper regions, the ancient submerged logs that had sheltered innumerable organisms. Soon, it was merely an enormous muddy hollow, reeking of decomposing organic material and expiring aquatic life. The springs that supplied it still seeped in, forming small, wretched puddles, but the pumps swiftly removed them. My lake had vanished, and the void it created was deafening. No more gentle lapping of water, no more amphibian chorus, no more sound of a leaping fish, only a vast, muddy lesion in the ground. Within a single week, even prior to the injunction hearing that was now irrelevant, the bulldozers commenced work. They pushed and leveled the fertile, dark mud, infilling the deeper areas with coarse gravel and building waste. The magnificent old oaks and maples that had encircled the lake, several of them, whose roots were now bared or were considered an obstruction to the parking lot's outline, were unceremoniously cut down, their venerable trunks hauled away. I experienced each cut of the chainsaw as if it were a wound to my own being. Then arrived the asphalt, hot, steaming black asphalt, spread thickly and pitilessly over my lake's final resting place. Roller machines compressed it into a sterile, nondescript surface. Finally, the striping machines came, painting precise white lines to demarcate the coveted parking spaces Henderson had desired for so long. He even had a small sign installed, "Willow Creek Estates Community Parking G. Henderson, President," his monument to short-sightedness. The entire transformation from a vibrant lake to a hideous parking lot took less than a month. Henderson paraded about like a triumphant general. Some residents offered him congratulations. Mrs. Gable simply shook her head sorrowfully when she encountered me, saying, "I am so deeply sorry, Arthur. It is a transgression." And it was indeed. It was an act of profound ecological destruction, motivated by trivial self-importance and a thorough lack of concern for anything beyond the most superficial human-made ease. Standing there, observing that repugnant black square baking under the sun, a location once so vibrant with life and charm, something within me solidified. Desperation began to transform into a cold, painstaking determination. They believed they had succeeded. They believed it was concluded. They were oblivious to what they had truly initiated. They had overlooked or perhaps never understood the elemental truth about water. You can shift it, you can redirect it, but you can seldom overcome it. Perpetually seeks its own level, perpetually recalls its intended course. And I, Arthur Jenkins, civil engineer and hydrologist, was on the verge of providing it with a little assistance in remembering. The weeks that ensued after the paving of my haven were desolate. Each morning, the initial sight from my window was that offensive blacktop rectangle where my lake once glistened. Henderson's white Escalade was frequently parked in the choicest spot, naturally, close to the entrance, shining under the sun. He would occasionally offer a slight wave if he noticed me, a gesture of victorious disdain. The HOA newsletter boasted about the triumphant completion of the project, emphasizing the improved community facilities. I kept away from my neighbors, sidestepped discussions. I withdrew into my residence, into my study, and into my reflections. The fury persisted, a cold, dense knot in my gut, but it was now overlaid with a feeling of resolve. This was no longer solely about retribution, although the idea of erasing that smirk from Henderson's face was undeniably a powerful incentive. This concerned justice. It concerned ecological equilibrium. It concerned demonstrating that nature, and the physical laws that direct it, cannot be so readily disregarded by bureaucratic decree and sheer obstinate ignorance. My specialization, hydrology, is frequently misunderstood. Individuals imagine it pertains only to dams and rivers, but its scope is far more intricate. It encompasses the complete water cycle: precipitation, infiltration, runoff, groundwater movement, evapotranspiration. It involves comprehending how water navigates through and interacts with the terrain, both visibly and invisibly. My lake had not merely been an attractive feature. It was a fundamental component of the local hydrological system. It served as a natural recharge area for the shallow aquifer beneath Willow Creek estates. It functioned like an immense sponge, absorbing precipitation, particularly during intense storms, and then gradually releasing it into the earth or through very slow surface discharge. This regulated groundwater levels and managed runoff. By draining it, and critically, by substituting its permeable bed with an impermeable asphalt surface nearly 2 acres in extent, Henderson and his associates had not just obliterated a habitat. They had fundamentally disrupted the water equilibrium of the whole region. That enormous sheet of asphalt now functioned like a massive barrier, stopping rainwater from seeping into the ground where the lake had been. That water, which previously would have been taken in and handled by the lake, now had to find an alternative route. And water, being subject to gravity, tends to flow downhill as it happened, towards the majority of the residences in Willow Creek estates, including Henderson's own cherished property. I commenced my investigation in earnest. This was no longer driven by sentiment. This was predicated on science. I retrieved the original topographical surveys of the area from before development. I possessed copies from my initial property acquisition, and I cross-checked them with county archives. These maps distinctly illustrated the natural swales and indentations, the ancient routes water had followed for centuries. My lake, as it happened, was the main collection area for a reasonably substantial catchment zone. I examined the soil composition analyses that had been conducted prior to the construction of Willow Creek estates, predominantly clay loam, not ideal for swift percolation, which rendered the lake's function as a holding basin even more crucial. I meticulously scrutinized the HOA's own master drainage plan for the development, the one they were supposedly meant to follow. It was, as is common with such projects, designed considering the existing major water features, including provisions for the discharge and seepage from my lake. There was no plan for the lake's abrupt disappearance. Then, I studied the as-built schematics for the new parking lot, which I succeeded in acquiring via a Freedom of Information Act request to the county, since any considerable modification to drainage necessitates permits. The plans were substandard. The grading was elementary, chiefly intended to direct water off the asphalt rapidly. But where was it meant to flow? Primarily towards the lowest points along its periphery, which, to no one's surprise, were now directly upgradient of several properties, and also towards the very storm drains that had been inundated when they emptied my lake. Those drains were engineered for gradual street runoff, not the concentrated torrent from 2 acres of non-absorbent asphalt. My moment of insight was not a singular revelation but an increasing conviction founded on data. The elimination of the lake had accomplished 2 vital things. It halted the replenishment of the local aquifer from that particular location, and it concentrated surface runoff. The water table in the immediate vicinity of the former lake would likely decrease slightly at first, but the overall water table in the downslope areas of Willow Creek estates, deprived of the lake's regulatory influence and now exposed to more direct runoff from the new impervious surface, was almost certain to elevate, especially during wetter seasons. Properties that had formerly benefited from the lake lowering local groundwater were now poised to experience the reverse. Their basements, their crawl spaces, their foundations, which had enjoyed comparatively dry conditions due to my lake acting like a sump, were in for an unpleasant awakening. And the new parking lot itself, constructed on what was essentially a reclaimed wetland without sufficient deep drainage. Oh, that was destined to be fascinating as well. The concept for my strategy began to form. It was not about destruction. I would not be illicitly digging channels or rerouting pipes under the cover of darkness. That was Henderson's method, crude and transparent. My tactic would be nuanced, grounded in established hydrological principles, and entirely justifiable. I still retained ownership of my 5 acres. The HOA had obliterated the segment of my lake that extended slightly into what they asserted was a common area easement to legitimize their access, but the majority of the former lake bed, now interred beneath their asphalt, was still theoretically mine, or at least the land directly bordering it was. My intention was to control the water on my property, and to manage the water that was now draining off the HOA's new parking lot and onto or towards my land in a manner that was perfectly lawful and hydrologically sound. If that management inadvertently intensified the difficulties Henderson had unknowingly brought upon himself and his devoted adherents, well, that would merely be an regrettable, entirely foreseeable scientific outcome. I began by examining the natural drainage configurations on my own land, the paths water had consistently taken before the lake became its primary repository. There were ancient, almost indiscernible swales, slight depressions in the terrain that, over decades, had become overgrown and filled with fallen leaves. These swales, if cleared and perhaps subtly regraded, could very effectively direct water. And some of them, curiously enough, led in the general direction of the lower-lying parts of Willow Creek estates, areas that were historically likely somewhat damper before my lake matured into the efficient regulator it became. Then I assessed the new parking lot itself. It was graded to shed water, indeed, but not very astutely. A considerable portion of the runoff from its southern boundary, I determined, would now flow directly towards my property line. Previously, this water would have entered the lake. Now it was simply going to reach my land. I had every right to manage this new, concentrated flow. I resolved to construct a series of rain gardens and bioswales along that boundary. These are landscape elements designed to collect, temporarily retain, and filter stormwater runoff. They are environmentally beneficial, visually appealing far more so than asphalt, and highly effective. I would engineer mine to be exceptionally proficient at gathering the water from Henderson's ill-conceived project. And if, during particularly intense rainfalls, these highly efficient collection systems were to, let's say, overflow, well, water must find an outlet. And if I just so happened to have, through meticulous observation of natural contours and perhaps some minor, almost unnoticeable enhancements to those pre-existing swales on my own property, established paths of least resistance, well, that was merely prudent land stewardship. I was not instigating a flood, I was merely directing the water that Henderson had unleashed. He had removed the lake's capacity to absorb it. I was simply going to demonstrate where it now preferred to go. The elegance of it lay in its inaction. I would not be pumping water anywhere. I would merely be permitting gravity and nature, amplified by Henderson's own deeds, to follow their natural course. The thought brought the first sincere smile to my face in weeks. The game was afoot. The implementation of my strategy was an exercise in patience and finesse. I did not lease cumbersome machinery or create a significant spectacle. Instead, I labored primarily by hand, employing a shovel, a wheelbarrow, and a sharp observation of contours. I commenced with the old, overgrown swales on my land, the ones that historical maps and my own observations indicated were natural watercourses. I cleared them of refuse, deepened them just marginally, nothing drastic, merely enough to promote flow. I ensured they possessed a gentle, consistent slope leading away from my house and, coincidentally, meandering towards the lower-lying sections of Willow Creek estates, particularly the area where Henderson's residence was situated, along with those of several of his most fervent board member allies. It was arduous work but profoundly gratifying. Each scoop of earth felt like a minor act of restoration. Next followed the rain gardens and bioswales along the periphery of my property that adjoined Henderson's grand parking lot. I selected native plants recognized for their water tolerance and extensive root systems: sedges, rushes, irises, dogwood shrubs. These would not only absorb a substantial amount of water but also aid in decelerating its movement, enabling more of it to seep into the ground on my property, which was my stated, entirely valid objective. However, I designed the capacity of these features with great precision. They would manage a typical summer shower splendidly. But a prolonged deluge, or the kind of torrential rain we frequently experienced in spring and autumn, the runoff from 2 acres of impermeable asphalt would rapidly exceed their retention ability. And the surplus, well, it would naturally spill over and pursue the course of least resistance, which just so happened to be those newly refurbished swales. It was all entirely rational, completely defensible as responsible stormwater management on my own land in reaction to the altered drainage resulting from the HOA's construction. I even erected a small, refined sign, native plant rain garden, managing stormwater naturally. Henderson likely observed it and sneered, perceiving me as merely some nature-loving eccentric dabbling in the soil. He had no inkling he was observing the architect of his forthcoming aquatic predicament. The science was irrefutable. The former lake bed, now compacted and paved, no longer served as a detention basin or a recharge point for the aquifer directly beneath it. Instead, it functioned as a massive collector of rainwater, which it then discharged swiftly. This abrupt surge of water, with no upward path into the lake, was compelled to move sideways and downwards. The water table in the surrounding clay-rich soils, which had been regulated by the lake acting as a natural drain, would unavoidably start to rise. Consider it analogous to a bathtub. The lake was the drain. Henderson had obstructed the drain and then directed a fire hose, the parking lot runoff, into the general area. The tub was destined to fill and ultimately overflow. My rain gardens were merely a courteous endeavor to capture some of the initial spray. The fundamental issue was the plugged drain and the persistent fire hose. The initial indications were understated, manifesting approximately 3 months after the parking lot's completion, aligning with the start of the autumn precipitation. Mrs. Gable, my source, casually mentioned that several of her neighbors situated further down the incline were complaining about damp, musty odors in their basements. One homeowner, a steadfast Henderson supporter named Peterson, apparently discovered a small accumulation of water in his basement workshop following an especially heavy overnight rainfall. An occurrence he had never encountered in the 10 years he had occupied the house. He attributed it to a malfunctioning sump pump. Henderson, when questioned, dismissed these as isolated events and a result of deferred maintenance by individual homeowners. The irony was so palpable one could almost taste it. His new parking lot, meanwhile, was not draining as flawlessly as his specialists had assured. After a substantial rain, extensive shallow puddles would persist for days on certain portions of the asphalt, precisely where the deeper sections of my lake had once been, almost as if the ground below refused to relinquish its memory. Mosquitoes, which had never posed a significant problem when the lake's fish controlled their numbers, began to proliferate enthusiastically in these new, stagnant parking lot puddles and, as I soon learned, in the increasingly waterlogged lawns downhill. Then arrived the first genuinely substantial storm system of the season. It rained consistently for 3 days, not a deluge, but a steady, soaking rain, the type that thoroughly tests a landscape's drainage capabilities. I observed from my window, a cup of coffee in hand, as my rain gardens performed precisely as intended. They filled with water, the native plants appearing vibrant and content. The runoff from Henderson's folly sheeted across the asphalt reached the edge of my property and was largely contained. But as the rain persisted day after day, the gardens reached their saturation point. Water began to gently flow over their berms, spilling into the cleared swales. And those swales, now unimpeded, executed their function perfectly, channeling the surplus water away from my house and downhill along its ancient, predetermined courses. The subsequent week, the discontent within Willow Creek Estates intensified. Peterson's basement no longer merely had a puddle, it contained 3 inches of standing water. Several other residences along his street reported analogous problems. Lawns were sodden and remained saturated long after the rain ceased. Henderson's own meticulously kept front yard, I was pleased to note during a drive-by, had acquired a noticeable spongy texture, and his award-winning roses near his house's foundation appeared decidedly unwell, their lower foliage yellowing. He was observed prodding his lawn angrily with a garden fork, likely suspecting a fractured sprinkler pipe. He still had not made the connection. He was so convinced of his own genius in resolving the parking dilemma that he failed to perceive the much larger water predicament he had engineered. The water, denied its ancestral haven in my lake, was patiently, relentlessly starting to reclaim its domain, or at least to make its presence profoundly known in the newly lowest-lying, most saturated zones Henderson's project had unintentionally created. The delicate art of aquatic readjustment was well underway. The true spectacle commenced the subsequent spring. We experienced an exceptionally damp March, succeeded by a sequence of those archetypal April deluges that can quickly saturate the earth. My rain gardens and swales were by now well established, the flora flourishing, the channels unobstructed. The enormous, impermeable expanse of Henderson's parking lot gathered every single drop of that prodigious rainfall and, with no alternative outlet, directed it towards my property line. My systems gracefully accommodated what they could and then, with equal poise, relayed the voluminous surplus along the meticulously prepared routes. The impact on the downhill portions of Willow Creek Estates was no longer understated. It was striking. Lawns did not merely become spongy. They transformed into veritable marshes. Homeowners reported some pumps operating incessantly, only to subsequently fail. Basements that had remained perfectly dry for years were now chronically damp, with conspicuous mold ascending the walls. The musty odor Mrs. Gable had noted evolved into a pervasive reek of mildew in several houses. Driveways began to exhibit cracks as the saturated ground beneath them shifted. One unfortunate individual, a Henderson sycamore who had been particularly outspoken in endorsing the lake's destruction, discovered his entire backyard had metamorphosed into a shallow, fetid pond, complete with a burgeoning population of very noisy frogs, a detail of poetic justice that did not go unnoticed by me. Henderson's prized parking lot did not emerge unscathed either. The minor pooling of water from the autumn had escalated. Substantial areas of the asphalt, especially where the deepest sections of my lake had existed, began to sink marginally. Fissures emerged, and water seeped upwards through them. It appeared the ground beneath, thoroughly saturated and deprived of its natural drainage into the lake, was now retaliating. The parking lot, his monument to advancement, started to appear unkempt and boggy along its perimeters. Some of the parking spaces became unusable owing to standing water or muddy edges. His shining white Escalade now frequently displayed an attractive layer of mud along its tires and lower bodywork, much to his evident irritation. HOA meetings, as per Mrs. Gable's accounts, shifted from Henderson's self-laudatory addresses into chaotic, irate altercations. Residents pressed to understand what was occurring, why their properties were unexpectedly transforming into wetlands. Henderson, appearing progressively more stressed and less flushed, more of a pallid, damp green, I mused, initially attempted to attribute it to unprecedented precipitation and deteriorating infrastructure. He engaged a new team of specialists, a different engineering firm this time, likely one not on his holiday greeting list. They investigated, collected soil samples, and looked exceedingly troubled. I, naturally, adopted the persona of the concerned, mildly perplexed onlooker. When approached by worried neighbors, I would shake my head in sympathy. "It's a genuine pity what's transpiring," I'd remark. I'm not an authority on these sorts of issues, but it does make one ponder the consequences of altering the natural water table so significantly. That lake, you see, it retained a vast amount of water. And this new parking lot, well, it's a substantial expanse of hard surface where water formerly used to absorb. I would then indicate my flourishing rain gardens. I've been endeavoring to manage the runoff onto my property as effectively as possible, but there's a limit to what one can achieve when the entire system is disrupted. Sometimes during HOA meetings, which I recommenced attending merely to observe the developing pandemonium, I would innocently pose queries. Has anyone contemplated whether the removal of the lake and the compaction of that area for the parking lot might have, perhaps, rerouted groundwater flows or elevated hydrostatic pressure on foundations in the lower regions? Just an observation from a non-expert, of course. The phrase hydrostatic pressure lingered in the atmosphere, sounding foreboding and costly. Henderson would scowl at me, but he could hardly suppress a resident posing a seemingly sensible question. The new consultants eventually submitted their findings to the HOA board. I succeeded in obtaining a surreptitiously shared copy from a now thoroughly disenchanted board member who had quietly come to regret ever supporting Henderson. The report was devastating. It corroborated everything I knew to be factual. The elimination of the lake, coupled with the establishment of the extensive, impermeable parking surface, had catastrophically disrupted the local hydrology. The water table in the impacted zones had risen by several feet. The soil was thoroughly saturated. Their suggestions were a catastrophe for the HOA, widespread regrading of common areas, the installation of a complicated and exceedingly costly network of French drains and new, deeper storm sewers throughout the affected portions of the subdivision, and, most alarmingly for Henderson, recommendations for individual homeowners to install robust waterproofing systems, interior and exterior drainage, and multiple heavy-duty sump pumps, all at their own considerable cost. The projected expense for the HOA's portion of the remediation soared into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, necessitating enormous special assessments that incited open rebellion among the residents. Henderson's authority, once unquestionable, disintegrated. His residence, I observed with grim contentment, was among the most severely affected. His basement was a total ruin, and a new, permanent water feature had materialized in his backyard, tenaciously defying all efforts to drain it. His cherished roses had long since perished. His Escalade was perpetually grimy. At an especially contentious emergency HOA meeting where residents were vociferously demanding his removal, Henderson finally broke. He rose, his face ashen, and declared he was resigning as president, effective immediately, attributing it to health concerns. The room did not erupt in applause, but in a sort of exhausted, yet still incensed, release. The consequences were disorganized, costly, and profoundly gratifying. The HOA, under new, humbled leadership, was compelled to secure a substantial loan to initiate the most critical drainage repairs. The highly sought-after parking lot transformed into an emblem of Henderson's imprudence, partially inundated for months on end, its asphalt fracturing and warping. Many of the spaces remained unusable. My property naturally was entirely unaffected. My house, positioned on slightly elevated terrain and shielded by my meticulously engineered swales and rain gardens, stayed dry and sound. I even commenced a new endeavor on my portion of the former lakebed, not a complete restoration of the lake, for that was now unfeasible, but the creation of a series of linked ponds and wetlands, a lovely, natural-looking water feature that once again drew birds, frogs, and dragonflies. It was my small piece of paradise, revitalized, and a persistent visual admonition to Willow Creek estates regarding the proper treatment of water. Some residences in the lowest-lying areas never fully recuperated and were sold at a considerable deficit, their new proprietors grimly cognizant of the persistent water management challenges. Henderson, I learned, disposed of his house for a pittance and relocated out of state. Good riddance. They asphalted paradise and erected a parking lot. I merely, gently and systematically reminded them that nature invariably has the final say. And occasionally it brings the marsh along with it directly to your threshold, especially when you have extended an invitation by obstructing its natural drainage. It is truly exasperating when such groups believe they possess superior knowledge, particularly when their conclusions are so profoundly mistaken.